Today, we will talk about inheritance. It seems like a pretty good concept. You have lived your life, worked hard, saved up, and had some fun along the way. Now you're old and have lived a full life. You had kids, raised them to be decent human beings, and they eventually flew the nest and started a family of their own. As your days come to an end, you enjoy the thought of being able to leave them some of your hard-earned money, whatever you can spare to make their lives a little easier. And while that is true for most, for the rich, inheritance takes a wholly different proportion. They inherit piles of money, folders full of stocks, and streets full of buildings and whole companies. Their inheritance is so large that while the median inheritance in the US, so the inheritance amount that is received most often in 2022, is $69,000, but the average is bumped up to $707,000 just by the sheer amount of money that the rich inherit. And this is the part that many people take an issue with. These people already have so much, and when they inherit, the inheritance tax that they have to pay is actually quite small in comparison. In many countries, you barely have to pay any inheritance tax on companies, which are one of the biggest assets people can inherit. Plus, with all of the best lawyers that they can afford, there are many ways in which loopholes are taken advantage of. And in the end, they have to pay far less inheritance tax relative to what they get. Interestingly enough, there are some of the rich who see the injustice in this. In the DACH region, so Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, there's actually an initiative by millionaires calling for higher taxation of assets worth millions, including the taxation of inheritance. They note that according to estimations, 1% of the German population holds 35% of the assets, while 40% have no savings at all. As such, they call for a tax reform, which would include substantially more taxes for the ultra-rich, including a limitation of exemptions for business assets and other special regulations for the inheritance tax and the sessions tax. Welcome to Rebel Economics. In today's What If episode, we will look at what would happen if riches could no longer be inherited. I doubt that this will ever turn into a real-life scenario, but it is a curious question to consider, which is why we love the option of exploring entirely new topics through the thought experiments like this one. If you enjoy it too, like and subscribe. Apart from our usual content about business economics, we will keep releasing What If videos. The main reason why the exorbitant amount of inheritance some receive is seen as such a negative thing is because it reinforces existing injustices. The rich become richer and richer still. So what if that were not the case? Would society really become more fair? In order to only target the richest with an inheritance tax of 100%, let's say that the cutoff point is $1 million. So up to 1 million, you wouldn't be taxed at all for the inheritance. But anything above that would belong entirely to the state. Most people would not be affected by this, since the median inheritance is at $69,000. So even if you are better off than most, you would not have to fear this scheme. So let's say you inherit your parents' mansion, which is worth $2 million. Since you haven't had any inheritance prior to that, you still have the full $1 million you can get untaxed. But the additional $1 million, which the house is worth, you would then have to pay to the state, either through cash on hand, through a loan, or some type of scheme to pay off the house. The same would go for companies, which tend to be worth a whole lot more. So let's first look at the potential upsides this may bring. For one, inheritance would be a lot more spread out. Instead of just your immediate family like children and grandchildren inheriting, you, as one of the filthy rich, would split it among as many people as possible so that as little money as possible would go to the state. Plus, since we are talking about the ultra-rich, they have created a type of dynasty where everyone around them, all their family, is rich too. So it might not be easy to find a relative that hasn't inherited $1 million yet. So chances are that this would cause a spillover effect to people you're not related to. Maybe you would instead give some to your nurse who has taken care of you for the past couple of years, or your housekeeper, or your grandchild's favorite teacher. or you may simply choose to donate a lot more to a cause that you're passionate about. Because while the rich are known for philanthropy, the continuance of the family dynasty will always come first. If this is no longer an option through inheritance, it is very likely that those normal people surrounding the rich will actually become heirs themselves. This would probably also be true for the inheritance of companies. The inheritance would be diffused, leaving a lot more people with a stake in the company than would traditionally be the case. That might have some difficulties, as all of a sudden there are more people who have an interest in either running the company or at least being heavily invested in doing well. That might lead to internal disagreements, making the management of the company more difficult and causing infighting. Oftentimes, the children of the company owners are taught in the ways of the company at a young age, as they will one day take over. In that way, family-owned companies can come up with more long-term plans, as there is a continuance that is not the case otherwise. But democratization of inheritance may also end up being a positive thing. Just because you're the child of a mogul doesn't mean that you're a great businessman or a woman yourself. You may yourself not be suited for the position at the helm of the company, whereas some cousin of yours might be. While in the traditional inheritance structure, that would likely not matter, if everyone can only inherit $1 million shares in the company, the heirs would be all equal, giving that one natural leader a fighting chance to run the company. So, with more people getting an inheritance with a scheme, there certainly is a democratization at play that would make the system more just. But also because the state would likely be getting a hefty sum of money from inheritance that value more than $1 million. Currently, the largest inheritance is that of Hubertus from Baumbach, whose estimated inheritance is at $42.2 billion. So imagine how many people would have to inherit something of his, so that nothing would go to the state. And with that money taken from the wealthy, the state could then distribute the money as needed, for example, for welfare programs, schools, or public health care. But these potential upsides are just one side of the coin. And there are some very strong downsides of the scheme as well. Having to pay 100% taxes on anything over $1 million might force heirs to declare bankruptcy when inheriting the family business, because they cannot afford to pay the difference. If this were to happen on a large scale, it could actually have negative impacts on the economy at large. People would lose their jobs, and efficient contributors to the local economy would be shut down. Therefore, even with the proposed scheme, there would have to be a certain safeguard to protect the continuance of companies, most likely through long-term plans of how the taxes could be paid off. Also, if only one country decides to crack down on inheritance by taxing anything worth more than $1 million 100%, this country would of course become very inopportune for wealthy people. No one wants to be forced to give their money away, and that is essentially what would happen with this scheme. So the rich would probably not stay, and instead join their peers in residing in tax havens like Luxembourg or the Cayman Isles. And the same goes for their companies. They would likely transition the operation to a new location in a country with more favorable inheritance tax laws, meaning the country would lose out even more, not just on the inheritance tax, but on all the other taxes and sources of revenue that these rich people represent, like income tax and estate tax, etc. So taking all of this into account, one has to ask, would this scheme really reduce inequality? In one aspect, I would say yes. Everyone who does not inherit more than $1 million, which would be most of us, would not have to pay any inheritance tax at all. So in that regard, this scheme definitely favors those without enormous assets. But would the state really make more money this way? After all of the inheritance tax from us normal people would be gone, and only that of the very wealthy who actually stay in the country would remain. So while it is hard to determine how many would really move abroad, I think the scheme may actually be detrimental and affect the country's economy for the worse. So now we are left with having looked at the question of what if wealth could not be inherited. But I think it is reasonable to say that the harsh crackdown that this scheme proposes would really just be a country shooting itself in the foot. So instead of this very radical proposition, I would like to wager a different one. Getting rid of exceptions, and while not taxing the super rich 100%, still putting a hefty tax on their inheritance. This may be a middle path between the many ways in which the rich can avoid paying inheritance tax now, and the extreme version of the state taking everything that is worth more than $1 million. This way, the state may actually get more money through inheritance tax, which it could then spend on reducing the inequalities in society. Thank you for tuning in to Rebel Economics and our new What If series. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, like and subscribe or leave a comment. We really appreciate and love to hear your feedback. If you have already done so, then let me say thank you. It really means a lot. And if you want more fun economics content, check out our channel. We have some really cool videos, so why not check out what would happen if only robots worked? Or check out our video where we ask ourselves if Marx was right about economic crises being the end of capitalism. Thanks for tuning in and see you next time.